The attic creaked under Mark's feet as he rummaged through his late grandfather's belongings. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy window. His fingers brushed against something solid beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Curious, he pulled it out, an old radio, its dials tarnished and unmarked. Mark had always been fascinated by radios. The idea of having to tinker with frequencies to find different broadcasts. So different from just typing in whatever you want on YouTube or pressing shuffle on Spotify. This discovery felt like a gift from beyond the grave. Excited, he lugged it downstairs to his makeshift workshop, plugged it in, and began to fiddle with the dials. Static crackled through the speakers. Mark's fingers danced across the tuner, searching for a clear signal. It took him several tries to get it just right, but suddenly a crisp voice pierced through the white noise. And in today's news, President Kennedy addressed the nation regarding the ongoing situation in Cuba. Mark's brow furrowed. Kennedy? A history channel, perhaps? But as he listened, the broadcast seemed too immediate, too real. It was as if he was hearing a live transmission from 1962. Strange though it was, he assumed he had simply found a channel for audiobooks or plays. And satisfied that at least the radio seemed to be working, he left to go to bed. He spent the next few nights dialing to other frequencies. To his growing surprise, he heard snippets of news from various decades. The moon landing, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Each broadcast crystal clear, as if happening in real time. But he was no expert on how radios worked. Maybe this one was specifically tuned to certain content. How fascinating if an old technology such as this could do that. But on the fifth night, something changed. Mark tuned into a frequency he hadn't tried before, and a familiar voice filled the room. Mark spending another evening alone in his workshop, tinkering with that old radio. If only he knew what he was getting into. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was describing him, his actions, in present tense. Heart pounding, he switched off the radio. What in the world was that? Surely he must have heard wrong. Before he could stop to think otherwise, he turned the radio back on. He was only greeted by silence. Breathing a sigh of relief, he stumbled to bed, convinced he was hallucinating from lack of sleep. The next day, he couldn't shake the memory of that broadcast. Against his better judgment, he returned to the radio that evening. As he approached the same frequency, his hands trembled. "There he is again," the voice said, a note of amusement in its tone. "Hello, Mark. We've been waiting for you." Mark recoiled, nearly knocking over the radio. "Who are you?" he demanded, feeling foolish for speaking to a machine. "We are the guardians of the Wavelength," the voice replied. "Your grandfather knew us well." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "What are you talking about?" "Your grandfather was one of us, Mark. He helped us bridge the gap between times, using radio waves to transcend the boundaries of past, present, and future. But he grew, afraid. He abandoned us, hid the radio. We've been waiting for someone to find it again." Mark's mind reeled. His grandfather had always been secretive about his past. But this? It seemed impossible. "This is a prank, isn't it?" he said, his voice shaking. "If this is for some content, it's not very funny." "Are we?" the voice asked. "Check behind the radio's back panel. You'll find proof there." With trembling fingers, Mark pried open the panel. Inside, he found a yellowed photograph of his grandfather standing with a group of people, all wearing strange antenna-like headgears. On the back, in his grandfather's handwriting, "The Guardians, 1955. Over the next few days, Mark's life became a waking nightmare. The radio followed him, appearing in rooms all over the house even after he'd nailed the door to his workshop shut. He'd wake up to find it next to his bed, whispering his name. He was so haunted by its voice that even at school, he'd hear phantom broadcasts from his computer speakers, describing his every move. He was no longer sure if it was all in his imagination or not. As his sanity frayed, Mark delved into his grandfather's journals, searching for answers. He found cryptic references to the convergence and reality manipulation through electromagnetic resonance. The more he read, the more he realized the terrifying scope of what he was dealing with. The Guardians weren't just listening to broadcasts from other times and speaking to those who would listen. They were actively influencing events, shaping reality and manipulating people's thoughts through the power of radio waves. And now they wanted Mark to join them. "Think of the possibilities," the voice crooned one night. "You could change history, Mark." Save lives, prevent disasters. All you have to do is embrace the wavelength. The offer was tempting. Mark thought of all the good he could do, all the pain he could prevent. But then he remembered the fear in his grandfather's journals, the warnings scrawled in shaky handwriting. The power is too great. It corrupts. We're losing our humanity. Mark made his decision. He wouldn't join them, but he also couldn't run forever. There was only one way to end this. He smashed the radio. To his horror, even in pieces, the radio continued to emit that eerie voice, telling him he was making a huge mistake. For a split second he faltered, suddenly unsure this was the right way. But at least he had to try something. So he gathered every piece of the radio equipment that were scattered on the floor and piled them in his backyard. As he doused the bits of metal in gasoline, the voice from the old radio grew frantic. "You can't do this, Mark. You're one of us. You can't escape your destiny." Mark struck a match. "Shut up," he said. "I'm ending this. For good." As the flames engulfed the pile, the voices screamed and distorted, a cacophony of terror and rage. Mark watched, transfixed, as the old radio melted, its dials bubbling and warping. And for the first time in weeks, there was absolute silence. In that moment, he felt a shift in the air, as if reality itself was resettling. The voices faded, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the distant wail of sirens. Mark sank to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew there would be consequences, questions from the police, concerns from neighbors, but for now all that mattered was the blessed silence in his head. As he watched the last embers die out, Mark made a silent promise to his grandfather. He would guard this secret, ensure that the wavelength remained forgotten. Some powers were too dangerous to wield, some frequencies better left untuned. In the driveway, someone's car radio crackled to life, and Mark started. But it was only an old song. Mark sighed and tried to put it all at the back of his mind. He wasn't sure what would happen next, and he'd probably be scared of radios for a long time. But for now, the forgotten frequency would remain just that, forgotten. Mark thought he had silenced the voices forever when he burned his grandfather's radio. But 6 months later, on a stormy night, his speakers crackled to life on their own. "We did tell you, Mark. You can't escape the wavelength," a familiar voice hissed through the static. Mark's blood ran cold. He lunged to his table and ripped the cords of his speakers from the wall. But not a minute later, his laptop screen flashed, and the same voice chuckled through the machine. "The same old trick won't work no more, Mark. We've evolved, and now we're coming for you." Horrified, Mark slammed his laptop shut, though he knew it might not do any good. If they could come through any speaker, radio wavelength or no, nowhere was safe. But as if to tease him, the voice spoke no more, leaving in its wake a silence so heavy with dread, it threatened to suffocate him. Over the next few days, the voice's intention became clear. They no longer cared for Mark to join them. All they wanted was to make Mark's life a living hell for rejecting them. Mark's world became a nightmare of ghostly frequencies. His phone would ring with no caller. The overhead speaker at school would spout bursts of static whenever he was alone in the hall. His neighbor's car radio blared warnings of his impending doom when he walked past. Even his microwave beeped in erratic Morse code, threatening to tear his sanity apart. He couldn't sleep, constantly woken by sounds from one machine or another in his house. At first, he tried to stay around his friends, hoping the voice would leave him alone. But somehow they found little ways to torment him. Slight blips on the radio, a sputter of static on the speakers, a fridge that would start humming too loud. He grew paranoid, jumping at every little sound, and his friends started to ask questions. But how was he supposed to explain any of this? No one else could hear the messages, and no one thought these random sounds were anything out of the ordinary. His parents, who were often away for work, also grew concerned at how more and more haggard-looking he became. One evening, he overheard them talking about whether he needed therapy. Only Mark knew the truth. The guardians of the wavelength wanted revenge. One night, exhausted and on edge, Mark dozed off in front of his computer. He jolted awake to find himself in a strange, shimmering landscape. The air hummed with static, and in the distance he saw towering antennas pulsing with eerie light. Welcome to our world, Mark, the voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere. The world between frequencies where we've waited for so long. Panic gripped him as he realized he was being pulled deeper into this spectral realm. He tried to wake up, to pull himself back to reality, but the radio waves seemed to have a physical form here, wrapping around him like tendrils. A sensation like a horde of ants crawling all over his skin started to spread up his legs, and his heart almost seized in horror. Somehow, he knew his very essence was being tuned to their frequency, threatening to erase his humanity. "You can't fight it, Mark," the voice taunted. "Your grandfather tried, but in the end, he joined us. It's in your blood." But Mark remembered his grandfather's warnings, the fear in his journals. With every ounce of willpower, he focused on the physical world, on the sensation of his fingers on the keyboard, the chair beneath him. The Guardian sensed his resistance. The landscape around him warped and twisted, assaulting him with nightmarish visions from every era of history. He saw wars, disasters, and horrors yet to come, all broadcast through their twisted frequencies and distracting him from his grip on reality. "Come now, Mark," the voice whispered seductively. "Won't you like to meet your grandfather?" That caught Mark's attention, and his head snapped up. "What did you say?" he asked through gritted teeth. So bound now by the wavelength, even controlling his own voice had become difficult. "Well, meeting might be a bit of an overstatement, but he is here, you know. He is here, in the wavelengths, all around you. He is us. After all, we are not corporeal, nor are we separate beings. Our voice is also his voice, our thoughts, his thoughts. We had transformed him, just like we will transform you." The voice crooned, its tone relaxed as if merely speaking of the weather. But Mark had become horrified beyond words, and he felt bile rise in his throat. So his grandfather had not fallen ill. They had taken his life. With a surge of determination, spurred by anger and pain, Mark let out a furious cry and tried to break free. The swarming sensation had nearly reached his chest, but he fought to keep down his panic and began to imagine a wall of silence, just as his limbs fought against their invisible chokehold, a barrier against the endless broadcasts. He pictured radio waves shattering against it, their messages lost in the void. A searing hot pain lanced up his neck, and his head felt like it was about to explode, but he continued to fight. His limbs felt like they were on fire, and tears streamed down his face. Around him, the Guardians started to wail in fury as they felt their connection weakening. The ghostly landscape began to fade, the antennas crumbling into static. "You can't win, Mark," the voice howled, growing distant. "We'll find another way. We'll always be broadcasting, waiting for someone to tune in." With a gasp, Mark snapped back to full consciousness. His room was silent, save for the gentle hum of his computer. On the screen, a single line of text blinked. "Connection lost. Signal not found." Trembling, Mark stood up. The air felt clear, free from the oppressive weight of hidden frequencies, but he knew this was only a temporary victory. Somewhere in the static between stations, the Guardians were conspiring, searching for a new wavelength to exploit. And Mark decided that this time he wasn't going to wait for them to come back for him. Next time, he was going to be ready. He wasn't yet sure of how, but if he didn't try, he was just as good as dead. He glanced at his computer, then began to type. The world needed to know the truth, even if it sounded insane. Because somewhere out there, someone else might stumble upon an old radio, and the nightmare would begin anew. As he wrote, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him was still tuned to that otherworldly frequency. And in the back of his mind, barely audible, he could still hear the faint whisper of static. Waiting.